Okay, awesome. So thanks everyone for coming. We're really excited to chat about kind of your future career path and how you decode that and what questions you should be asking and just kind of things to think about in terms of looking at your career, your future career. So we'll briefly introduce both of ourselves. I'll start. I'm Colton. I am an engineer business analyst at Grainger's mid-tier and site reliability engineering teams. I've been with Grainger for about 10 months, I think now. At the time really flies. um, and I went to IU for my undergrad, which I got a degree in marketing and information systems. And then I also did my master's at IU because I'm a glutton for punishment. And I did that 5th year at Kelly's MSIS program. So definitely really love IU and Grainger, and kind of the relationship that Grainger's built with IU has been really great to kind of be a part of. But yeah, Emily, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Emily. I'm currently in the same program at Grainger as Colton. We're currently part of the engineering development program. We both work as engineering business analysts there. And I actually did not go to IU, unfortunately, but I did go to University of Michigan. Graduated last year in mechanical engineering and am now working as an EBA, currently on the order management team.
Great. All right. So we'll quickly give an overview of what we're talking about today. So at a high level, we're first going to give you kind of a day-to-day of a couple different roles spanning data engineer, software engineer, as well as business systems analyst and business analyst, and just kind of chat about the different career paths you might encounter that you might be interested in taking a look at. And kind of our relationship with those different roles and what those roles could mean for you. Then we'll chat about the skills that you're going to hopefully need as well as utilize in your day-to-day at these various roles, and kind of chat about just how to think about the different roles and what skills you're going to need and how to apply those. And then we'll talk a bit about Agile and how it's used in the industry today. And then we'll go over industry versus consulting and kind of the differences there. And we'll also chat about how to prepare for these different roles in these environments, as well as a recap at the end where we'll kind of kick it over and open it up for questions. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So I'll briefly touch on what the different roles of business analyst and data engineer are like, and then Emily will kind of cover software engineering and business systems analyst. So starting off with data engineer, everyone's day-to-day is going to be a little bit different, but also very similar, because every day is going to start up with a stand-up, which is something we'll kind of touch on in Agile, but everyone typically starts their stand-up in the morning. But after that, the day really kind of diverges. And depending on your role, you might be tackling vastly different tasks. Specifically for the data engineer, at pretty much any company, these data engineers are kind of thinking about data and architecting it in different ways, such as how much data are we receiving? How much data are we expecting to have? How do we kind of design our databases to hold all this data? How can we better picture this data? So Sam, who's in the call, he's working on our Power BI team. And so he's kind of thinking about data visualizations and how do we take the data we have and kind of turn that into usable information for people. But those are just like a few of the questions that data engineers kind of tackle every day. I started my Grainger career off on the Teradata, so our data warehousing team. So I was in the analytics space. And a lot of my day working with data engineers was kind of focused on answering questions like, how do we get data from A to B, or point A to point B? How do we kind of take the data we have and leverage it in better ways? How do we drive value for the business with the data we have? And then also, what data do we maybe not have that we could use? And how do we get that data? So those are just kind of a few small aspects of what the data engineer might be doing. And a lot of their day is likely going to be spent in SQL. So kind of the language that kind of underlies all the databases, and trying to write code that essentially manipulates that data and brings it where you want it and turns it into actionable things like dashboards or queries or kind of outputs that are actually usable to the business and not just small data points within the database. This is in contrast with the business analyst, where it's kind of more business facing, if the name it doesn't imply that, because the business analyst, in contrast, is definitely more front facing, understands more of the business kind of front applications, whereas the data engineer is a bit more in the back end and definitely dealing with things further back than the business analyst. But a business analyst is definitely working on making actionable insights from the dashboards and kind of taking the data just a bit further, but doing a lot less engineering per se. The business analyst isn't really creating databases or trying to find better ways to make a database more optimized, for example. The business analyst is saying, hey, we've got the data here thanks to the data engineer. How do we take that and turn that into something that a manager or a director might use? So as the cute little icon there kind of indicates, definitely it's really creating more dashboards and actionable insights at the front end level that is going to be used by people in the business, like managers and directors. I briefly worked in an internship at C.H. Robinson where I was a business analyst, and I was definitely doing a lot of those things. And one of my key projects was creating a Power BI dashboard that kind of focused on a 3-year analysis on our business and the different implications of market timings and things like that. So it's not to say that the business analyst is not skilled in SQL or not dealing with data, because they very much are, but it's just more if you're kind of a bit more in the back end as a data engineer or the front end as a business analyst. And both those roles definitely have to have these technical underlines of being able to code SQL, being able to build good, elegant dashboards, but they kind of focus on 2 different things and kind of provide value to the business in different ways. But I'll go ahead and now kick it over to Emily to chat more about the differences with the day-to-day of a software engineer as well as a business systems analyst.
Thanks, Colton. So like Colton, I did work on a previous team that focused mostly on data quality. So I was working mainly with data engineers, but this new team that I've currently onboarded onto is mostly software engineers. So what I've noticed in terms of fundamentals, of course, data engineers are going to work mostly in SQL, but software engineers really have to have that foundation in certain programming languages like Python, Java, C++, as well as those coding fundamentals like algorithms, data structures, debugging skills. And that day-to-day, although can vary much between team to team, the overall core of it is building new software and modifying existing software to meet our user needs. So as you're building that new functionality or enhancing existing functionality, that might be part of a small work effort. So kind of a one-off, a change within a program, a change within a service, or that could be blown up into an entire project, depending on how much effort is needed. The way work comes in team to team may vary, but as a software engineer, you're going to be brought in, especially for projects, very, very early on to discuss one, technical background, as well as design discussions to figure out different solutions for the issue or build or enhancement that you're trying to make. This will help also evaluate an estimation for the amount of effort that will go into work, and this will all be done before development actually begins. And so those are the meetings that they'd usually be brought into, as well as working collaboratively, of course, with everyone on the team, especially other engineers who might have better knowledge on a certain system or functionality, and they might just work together on solving those issues. Now, moving on to the business systems analyst, I know that sounds very close to business analyst, but they actually do have very key differences. The business systems analyst role is very much close to what Colton and I are currently doing as engineering business analysts. And when I get asked about my role, it's kind of hard to pinpoint, but we cover so much. But I would say that overall, we're really responsible for keeping work moving on a team. So you're going to ensure that the right requirements are executed for, let's say, enhancements to a software or completely new builds that actually provide value to the business. As a BSA, you're going to be bridging the gap between stakeholders and either software or data engineers, just depending on what kind of team you end up working on, to capture the correct requirements that do provide that business value and kind of bridge that with the technical solutions that are actually feasible. And you're going to, again, have those discussions with your developers. And you're going to continue that communication throughout that piece of work, that project, to make sure that everyone on the business side and everyone on the technical side is aligned. In terms of day-to-day, that will very much depend on whether you're on a project or not. So let's say you're not on a project. Your work every day will center around outlining what needs to get done and how for your engineers, your testers, your stakeholders. That comes with understanding impacts of the functionality your team is either building or modifying. You're going to understand what business value is. And you also need to understand the technical details of how it gets done. You're not going to have that expertise that your data engineers have and your software engineers have, but you do need to be able to understand data flows, processes, where to actually pull data from, be able to dive into the systems you actually work in to kind of create that full picture. And when you're on a project, that comes with facilitating and managing project work. So you're going to help plan out the project, you're going to help estimate work effort, you're going to capture the requirements for a project and participate in those design discussions to break down the work, and also help plan testing efforts so that in the end, your team is able to meet project deadlines that are expected by the stakeholders. So I think we can move on to the next slide.
Alrighty. Great. So yeah, to kind of just wrap that up, I mean, we've touched on a few different roles, but that by no means is all of the roles. And everything will be different based on, which company you're in, which industry you choose, and which role you might be starting off as. But we can kind of talk about kind of the similarities between these and how the teams are structured. And to do that, we have this lovely picture here, which is the interior architecture model. And it essentially breaks down software by presentation, logic, and data. So the presentation tier is what the client sees. So if you think of google.com or grainger.com, this is kind of what you see when you go visit those websites. Even kelly.iu.edu, what you see there is the presentation tier. The logic tier is kind of the muscle, if you will, of the software application. This is kind of what the software can do. So if you think of kelly.iu.edu, this is kind of just serving pages and providing you information for your classes or something. Google.com, their logic tier is really focused around search, obviously. And then the data tier is the databases, which we were talking about a little bit earlier when we were talking about business analysts and data engineers. And the data tier is kind of what the software can remember. So we kind of want to introduce the interior architecture model here and introduce that concept so we can structure kind of what we wanted to discuss with the different skills you might need. And as I go to the next slide here, we kind of broke this down again with that presentation, application, and data tier. And we did this to kind of discuss the different points of what you might be working on when you join a team, because a lot of what we talked about so far were very general roles. So data engineer or software engineer, and kind of applying those, we can kind of take a different look at that under this lens. So starting off, I'll give a brief high-level overview, and then Emily will jump in and follow up on this model. But kind of taking a look at the presentation tier, so that top box there, it really is focused on user experience, user interface, customer journey, and customer understanding. And really it's kind of the life cycle of what the customer goes through when they come to your website or your piece of software. So if you think of google.com again, you likely started off with a question, you went to google.com, you typed in a search query, and then you got a result. And hopefully the first 2 or 3 results answered your question. That was your customer journey. That was your user experience with google.com. If you think of Grainger.com, clearly my 2 favorite companies both start with G. And I'm not biased at all. But if you think of Grainger.com, you're probably coming on to buy or search for a product. You go to Grainger.com, you search for maybe some sort of machinery that you need, you find the product, you throw it in the cart, and you either check out at that point or you come back later to check out. Both times, the customer experience there, that front end part where you came onto the presentation tier, which was Grainger.com or Google.com or whatever example you like, and search for a product or typed in a search query, that was your customer journey with the companies. And those teams that focus on that always have that at the front of mind. They're always thinking about how they can improve their user experience, how they can improve the customer journey, how they can extract more data from that. But regardless, it's all about really kind of focusing their efforts around that. They're not really as concerned with the data architecture like some of the teams on the data tier may be. They're really focused around the customer journey. As we move on to the application layer or application tier, this is really more of how the systems talk to each other. I once was told by someone who was an integration architect that what they do at their job is they make computers talk to each other. And I feel like that was a great way of putting what the application tier typically does. This is how the computers talk to each other. And things like system integration, logic understanding, messaging, and resiliency, all those things are handled in this tier. It's not what you see, it's what happens underneath the hood. I'm not a big car guy. I definitely could not fix my engine or probably even change my oil, but I definitely would say that it's quite similar to kind of understanding how a car's engine works. My current team that I'm on, the mid-tier team, is kind of like the engine for Grainger, if you will. We handle how the system thinks and what it does. Emily's team, the MDM services team, or master data management, as she'll get into later, also does these things. But really, when you think about the application tier, it's how do the computers talk to each other and what can the computers do? And if you've ever worked with a computer before, computers are not very smart. They need to be told very, very strictly exactly what they can do. And this is a lot of work. And most customers never see the results of this work, but they feel it when they use the application. So if I went on google.com, for example, when I would type in a search query and hit enter and then get results, that's all happening via the application tier. I just see it as the presentation tier. And a lot of the teams that work here are really focused around logic and manipulating data and utilizing the data that they have on hand. And then lastly, the data tier is really about what the system can remember, as I mentioned. And so the teams around here are focused on what do we have, what do we need to have, and how much can we remember? And so my previous team, the Teradata team, was really focused around storing information, making use of information. We worked with data engineers like Sam, we worked with business analysts who were creating dashboards, and that was really all focused around manipulating and utilizing the data that we had on hand. So to kind of surmise the entirety of this, the skills that you'll be using are going to be quite similar across teams, but every team is going to use them a little bit differently. Whether you're in the presentation tier at the top and you're focused on understanding what the customer or the customer user experience or understanding how to present things better to the customer, or you're in the application tier and thinking about how can we make better logic. For example, how can we calculate pricing more accurately? How can we calculate how long a delivery takes? How can we do that better? Or if you're on the data tier and thinking about in terms of what can we remember and how can we utilize this information, it's all going to be utilizing very similar skills. You'll be likely utilizing SQL or data understanding or presenting information or communicating with leadership, but you'll be doing it in a different way and you'll be focused on a different piece of the pie, if you will. And we really wanted to kind of highlight this to show you that you might be, sending emails and working with people and building dashboards for the application tier, or you might be doing it for the data tier, but kind of the way that these teams are architected and centered around the different tiers is likely something you want to consider and think about when you kind of think of what team you might want to join and where you want to end up. Are you more of a data focused thinker? Are you more of a logic focused thinker? Or maybe do you like that user experience, user journey part? But I'll kick it over to Emily now to kind of talk more about these.
Yeah, definitely. Colton just did a great job with explaining everything. So I think I'm just going to give a few examples just from personal experience. So previous team that I was working on was very much in the application tier. This was the MDM, so the master data management / data stage team. Although we did have a somewhat presentation layer user interface, which you can see as DSUI, we were very much in the logic tier. So our systems would pull data, for example, from the Oracle database. We would transform the data, consolidate the data, separate data, and then move that along to different systems that might be more front-facing, like the presentation layer, or we might just send it over to another database back down in the data layer. So we had a lot of mobility in where our data could move, whether that be quote unquote up or down, upstream or downstream. Being on my current team, we definitely are on the logic tier, so the application tier, but we do have a presentation layer, which is SOE, because I'm currently on the order management team. So orders is our whole spiel. But we have two kinds of enhancements that we really work on. One is kind of that back end behind the scenes, manipulating the data, manipulating services. But then we have other changes that we call client changes, and that is actually going to affect the SOE application that our customer service agents use. And we might add a new button that they thought would be beneficial. They press that button, SAP does its thing in the background, and they get the information, they get the processes that they need accomplished, done and without any thought. So that's kind of my side on that.
Great. And just to kind of recap and think about this, this is not like all inclusive by any means. There's definitely teams that sit outside of these, different tiers. And two of the boxes here I kind of wanted to call out are resiliency and DevOps also include teams that don't kind of fit into this mold, but a lot of the teams that you'll be on do deal with these different tiers in some way. So whether it's the data or application or presentation tier, it's probably good to get a sense of where you feel your skills and interests lie, so you can kind of plan out maybe what team you want to be on. And the nice thing about Grainger is we are in an engineering development program, so we kind of get to rotate and try different teams. Not everyone gets to do that, and I mean that's also okay. But if you do have a sense of where your interests might lie, or maybe where your skill sets lie going in, that's always nice to get started off on the right foot. So moving on. Oh, yeah, there we go. So moving on, that while we kind of just chatted about breaking down understanding of the different teams and that interior architecture model, the presentation application, data layer, there's a lot of skills that are cross-functional on all these teams and that you'll be using regardless of if you're in the application or data or presentation tiers. And so we've kind of outlined some of them here. And just to kind of briefly chat about some of them, Emily and I will kind of go back and forth here, but Emily, do you want to kick us off and talk about some of these skills?
Yeah, definitely. So like Colton said, other than those technical skills and knowledge, which of course is probably a foundation that you're building now, maybe within your current coursework, there are definitely certain skills that would apply in maybe technology specific roles, but all roles in general. And one of those skills that I would like to point out is communication. I think no matter what industry you go into, what role you take on, what company you join, something that is really core to have is solid communication skills. You never know when you're going to have to facilitate a meeting, present your ideas, and to stakeholders to communicate your solutions, ideas, and thoughts well. And even communication with people internally. What I mean by that is maybe within your own team, within your own company, but you might have to communicate externally with your stakeholders, other vendors that you need to communicate with. And those are solid skills to come in with, but I think definitely those all can be developed as you start your career. And as you join a company and you start to learn your dynamics, those are definitely some things that you can facilitate. So I think coming in to Grainger, kind of as my first job out of graduation, there were definitely a few communication skills and cross collaboration skills that I had to learn, sometimes not the easy way. But one of them I'd like to point out is definitely everyone communicates differently, whether that be the platform you use. I mean, I might prefer using Microsoft Teams and someone might prefer email, and you have to accommodate that. Or I might read an email and my teammate might read the same email, and we might take on we might assume different tones from that email. But in the end, I think what's really important to remember is just everyone is always having good intentions, and everyone just wants to have effective collaboration just as much as you do. And I think especially with project work, it is really important to communicate early and ask the right questions. You definitely want to be clear so that once you've had that conversation, you understand what next steps need to happen. And you also want to have clarity to remove any assumptions, right? Just as a quick example, let's say, this is actually a situation that happened, but I got an email and it was a request from somebody asking that we move a file to a target location. Now, my thoughts on the target location was completely different on the target location that they had in mind. So it's really clearing up those details and making sure you communicate effectively. With communication and cross collaboration, those are both really key parts as well to project management. Other than that, you have delegation, leadership, the ability to kind of quickly problem solve to keep work on track. And I think, again, although I'm sure those are skills you are developing now, though, and you can leverage that when you come into your first job, you start your career, there's also some learnings with that, and learnings on your specific team. So how to effectively cooperate and operate on your team to achieve objectives that you might be responsible for. So as an EBA, so project management might be aligned towards more of a business systems analyst role, or if your role ends up involving any project work and management of that project work, you're going to have to be accountable for the project deadlines, the project work that comes in, making sure that's flowing. That will involve some planning, tracking of milestones. You also have to be able to manage the scope of your project, right? It's two key parts of one, being really flexible. Things are bound to change just based on circumstances throughout the project timeline, but also realizing that there's some constraints, maybe with time or the amount of money invested in your project. Another key piece of work, and what we do as EBAs pretty often, is documentation and diagramming, but I will hand that one off to Colton.
Great, thanks, Emily. So I will just point out one thing. Communication is super important, but I'm definitely going to have to say Slack is better than Teams for communicating. I'm not willing to negotiate this point.
I don't know about that one.
Okay, well, but yeah, so communicating verbally and in person is great. And it's quite easy, especially over Slack. But we've been in a bit of a pandemic for the past couple of years, and sometimes we have to communicate things offline and kind of communicate things without being in person, where we have a whiteboard in front of us where we can quickly just pull out a marker and chat about things. And documentation and diagramming is a skill set that you should not overlook when you're thinking about pretty much any role, whether it's data engineer, business systems analyst, business analyst, even project manager. Pretty much any of these roles are going to require some very good communication skills, and some of that communication is going to be nonverbal via documentation and diagramming. So I'm not quite aware where you're at in terms of classes and utilizing and learning these skills, but I definitely just want to point out that it doesn't matter if you for example, use UML, which is a type of kind of notation and diagramming that some people use, or BPMN, which is business process management notation, or any of the other notations. It doesn't matter as long as you have the kind of ability to diagram in any of the languages. You can just pick up and understand, oh, a box means entity, for example, or whatever the language kind of consists of. But as long as you have these skills that you can kind of represent systems and architectures on these kind of diagrams and with any notation, that's going to take you a long way. Some of my work I've done with Grainger on the resiliency team I'm on has highly consisted of documentation, and it's really an area in companies that is lacking. I've spent a lot of time trying to basically build diagrams out to understand Grainger's order to cash process, and that is something that is highly valuable, to have a kind of common, consistent language about how things work. And that the same is true of pretty much all of the companies that you could imagine. They all need to be able to understand the process and represent it visually, not just verbally. And the better you can make the picture, is even better. So I'm definitely no Da Vinci, but I'd like to think that dragging and dropping some boxes onto a diagram is a skill set I have, and it's a highly valuable one. So if you're thinking about just kind of approaching these roles, definitely work on your diagramming skills. It's something I'm really glad to have kind of up my sleeve. And then lastly, jack of all trades. This was one Emily and I were kind of talking about, like, how these 4 boxes here don't really represent everything we do day to day, but there's oftentimes I'm asked to kind of jump on a project or hop on a call, and it's not really something I can just throw in a box. It's a skill that I never thought I would be using. And so kind of being a jack of all trades, like, don't feel uncomfortable that you're not super comfortable, is I guess the best way to put it. A lot of the skill sets, you're going to have to develop over time, and it's okay to like learn on the job and kind of be trying to figure things out as you go. That's something I'd say Emily would definitely agree on. Like, we are frequently having to learn new things and kind of think on our feet here, and kind of just not make things up as we go, but learn as we go. And I think being a jack of all trades and kind of thinking about that, it's okay to not be a master of anything right now. But maybe think about some of the skills that you are strong with, like diagramming or communication or project management, and think about how you can apply those and continue to learn with those, and kind of leverage those in your job. Because if you're not already leveraging them, you definitely will be when you get started. And if there's something that you really are passionate about, like diagramming, documentation, you might do well as an architect or BSA, a business systems analyst. But if you're more passionate about coding, maybe you'd be a better software engineer. Or if you kind of like managing things and keeping projects on track, maybe you'd be a good project manager. But it's just a good frame of reference to really think about what you might be interested in and where you might want to go. And it's okay to not know all the answers to the questions right now. But as we move forward, now we're going to kind of talk about Agile. And so I'll briefly chat about the 4 boxes there: stand-up, planning, refinement, and retro, are the different Agile ceremonies. I'll be chatting about stand-up and retro right now, then I'll kick it over to Emily to chat about planning and refinement. Now, whether or not you've been exposed to Agile by now, if you haven't, congratulations, you made it this long. But if you have, you definitely know that this is kind of ambivalent in all companies. Everyone uses Agile to some degree. So we're not going to teach you Agile, but we're just going to talk about how you can apply it in the industry and what benefits it has. But to briefly introduce stand-up, which is one of the 4 Agile ceremonies we're going to be touching on, stand-up happens most of the time in the morning. Fun fact, you're not always actually standing during stand-up. You can be sitting, so that's okay. I tend to sit and have a coffee during stand-up, but the real point of stand-up as a ceremony is to kind of touch base with your development team. And I always thought it was just kind of silly to call something stand-up and agile and all these different terms, but the real benefit for this particular ceremony is to kind of again, touch base with your development team, especially right now when everyone's fully remote. The communication aspect of understanding what your development team's working on and what they're having issues with is kind of is extremely important. So most teams in pretty much any of the software industry will have stand up for anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. And every developer just kind of talks about what they're working on and if they have any blockers and what they're planning to work on. And the real important aspect about this is the blockers. I've found the most benefit from stand-up to occur when my development team's able to ask questions or get help. And frequently it's something they're working on. They have an issue. Maybe they don't understand a piece of technology. Maybe they don't know where to find documentation. Maybe they need help fixing a bug. All these aspects are really able to be solved in stand-up because you can kind of throw that out there and say, hey, I don't understand how this database works or how it was built. And then someone can go, oh, I know. And then they can hop on and help you out. And you can save yourself hours of banging your head against the wall. It's also great from a project management perspective because you can see how the work is progressing. And if something is slowing you up, maybe a team kind of didn't get their work in soon enough, so you're slowed up on your end. It just helps you understand the story behind the project work. And if there is a slowdown or if there is a blocker or an issue, you can kind of just understand why that's happening. And then if you're telling the story of that in a project update meeting or during retro, which I'll touch on, at least it just helps you understand a better picture. But in the end, the stand-up is really great just to kind of touch base with your team and make sure, you know, any heartburns or anything that are happening can be resolved quickly. Now, retro is kind of, as the name would imply, a retrospective reflection on this work. So during these meetings, what we do, and at other companies when we've had retros that I've worked at, like C.H. Robinson, for example, we really kind of look at the past. My current team, it's 2 weeks, but you know, it might be a month for your team, or it might be a week. It's really team specific, and that's okay. But we take a look at the past couple of weeks and say what went well and what didn't go well. And the conversation between the teams is really nice because it kind of helps us figure out where maybe we had some issues and what we can do to better kind of prevent those issues going forward. I specifically know on one of my teams, we had chatted about just kind of communicating and better defining work. And that was really helpful because the conversation we had as a product of the retrospective was that we kind of built better guardrails and understood better what questions to ask before we started working on a feature. I think Emily brought up earlier, sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, but helping understand like how you can ask questions to figure out what you don't know is really great. And in the retro, it kind of like lets everyone on the team sit down and chat about what went well and what didn't go well and how we can make it better the next 2 weeks or next month or two, however you want to look at that. But I'll kick it over to Emily now to talk about planning and refinement ceremonies in Agile.
Thanks, Colton. Like Colton was talking about with stand-up and retro, so Agile, since it's very much an iterative process, as you can kind of see on the graphic, very much a cyclical process with design, development, test, deploy, review, and that keeps going over and over again until you reach your kind of launch point for a piece of work or an entire project. So with stand-up kind of occurs throughout this entire process, from plan all the way through those cycles, all the way through launch. Retro kind of happens at certain points of where the work is broken down. And so at each kind of delivery point of your work, you're going to have that retro, like he said, to evaluate what went well, what went wrong. Now, what I'm talking about planning, that kind of fits at that very first arrow of the process. So that plan that you initially set out. Now, this isn't for the entire, let's say, project that you're working out. This isn't to plan that entire scope, but that's to take a piece of work and make sure that the whole team is aligned of that work, aligned on what work is coming in. So you want to ensure that each person responsible for a different piece of that work, one finds it manageable. And if not, this is the meeting to discuss that. If you need to delegate to another either software engineer or a data engineer, this is a time so that work keeps moving, but no one on the team is, let's say, overwhelmed. And having this meeting also allows you to have an initial plan for how each person should be approaching their work. So because work is always prioritized, they're allowed to see visually on a board that, let's say, our meeting facilitator will bring up, and they will show you what should be worked on top down so that they have a specific order and which one needs to be prioritized when they're currently working. Refinement, I would say on the graphic on the left, definitely falls on that design portion. So refinement would occur about once a week. So every piece of work that comes in, you're going to have a refinement meeting. And that is to socialize the pieces of work with the entire team. So I might lay out a piece of work in what we call a user story. So that lays out technical details, the business value, and I get to present that to the whole team. And this is the last chance to ensure that technical details are sufficient before development begins. This is the time for testers, if you have other BSAs on the team, testers, this is the time to ask questions, get clarity, and all be aligned on what work is about to be developed. And then at the end, if you find that that piece of work, that quote unquote story, requires more investigation, that would be evaluated at this meeting. And another benefit of this meeting is that you're allowed to estimate the amount of time and work that will actually go into what you're developing, and also testing. And this estimation has to be agreed by everyone so that you're all once again aligned. And I think the importance of all of these meetings that you have, although every team might do it differently, might have a different cadence, I think it's important to have these meetings so that the work moves consistently, efficiently, and just overall kind of be able to master that agile development process.
Great. All right. So taking us forward, we wanted to touch on the differences between industry and consulting. So Emily will briefly chat about industry, and then I'll take us into consulting. So yeah, Emily, did you want to?
Yeah, go, sure. So apart from, of course, deciding what roles might be the best fit for you, what skills you want to learn, what skills you want to leverage, there's also that question of, what kind of company do I actually want to work for? And so this is what we're trying to outline here. So basically working in quote unquote industry or consulting. So Colton and I definitely work on the industry side, so no biases whatsoever, but that a key focus of that is actually delivering technology as a product. So it's creating softwares, services, enhancing functionalities to an existing software, and two kind of sides of that is, if you look at the bottom, we have homegrown versus software services. So homegrown is definitely when a company desires to fill a gap where current software services on the market somewhat fall short. This approach is to really create and build that software from the ground up, which initially would take more time and money, but then you're able to really develop a tailor-made solution, and involves, I would say, much more creativity in terms of developing solutions for that product that you're creating. Because there's no bounds within an existing system that you have to make sure you follow, and there's no best practices out there. You really have that creativity to figure out what solutions are best. You kind of have that free reign. As opposed to that, we have software services, which let's say at Grainger, we have licensing agreements for softwares already in the market, and we get this from third-party providers. This can be, cloud-based softwares that we just access the internet. We can have actual softwares on-prem, but what our approach is more geared towards is, and companies like us, is to customize services and softwares to function to our end users' liking. So that approach is mostly configure and customization to fit those business needs. We need to still fit within the bounds of the systems that we're working in. We definitely do not want to break anything. But the kind of pro with that is that we're able to integrate our systems really easily, since we're not developing something completely independently like a homegrown software would be. It's much more integrated within one system. So it's a very seamless process of, taking that data from a database, so that data layer, and moving it all the way to a presentation layer and displaying, let's say, information to your customers. Another point about industry is that you're definitely focusing more on internal business needs. And what I mean by that is you're improving these systems internally. That kind of ties in with providing technology as a product. So you're improving that to meet the business needs. And then lastly, within industry, I would say you're growing within the specific industry that you have chosen. So you're going to build that core knowledge of the specific domain you're under. So with me on the order management team right now, let's just say, if I chose to stay on that order management team, I would build a great knowledge base on orders from beginning to end, that entire process. You also get to build long-term relationships with your fellow team members and the stakeholders, you interact with pretty much daily. And to really gain that knowledge about other domains outside of your team, outside of your department, outside of your organization, that's really done through cross-functional projects, or even moving out of that team and getting experience either in a different role or a different system altogether. And then Colton, would you like to talk about the consulting side?
Absolutely. So I really kind of just want to reiterate, I really like the approach bullet under homegrown and software. Homegrown is, asking the question, what can we create? Whereas software is, or the pre-built software solutions is asking the question, what can we configure? And I think, even if you're a software engineer on the homegrown team, like Grainger.com, versus a software engineer on the SAP team, that really is the thought process. It's vastly different, homegrown versus software, which is, a really good thing to think about and kind of understand before you jump onto the teams. Now, on the other side, other end of the spectrum is consulting, which isn't necessarily maintaining any of these software services. It's really kind of understanding a lot about the various industries you're consulting for. So as Emily said, we're both in industry at Grainger, so we're, maybe a little bit biased, but I have done a bit of consulting in the past and do some on the side with some personal clients of mine. So I am excited to kind of speak to what consulting is like and what you can gain from it, because there's actually a lot of just, great applications from consulting. So just off the bat, consulting, it can be a nice career path because there's a lot of mobility and a lot of growth that you'll get. Industry is a bit slower. And when we say industry, we're specifically, anything that's not consulting. So Grainger, for example, would fall under industry. But it's definitely a bit calmer. My friends in consulting, they are working slightly longer hours, but they're also on really exciting projects and getting to kind of grow their skills and kind of apply themselves in different ways than I am. And consulting is great because every 6 months to 2 years, roughly, depending on what project you're on, you'll get a new project. And it's an entirely different experience. Like it's as if you switched an entire job and company, and now you're on a whole new project. And it challenges you to kind of learn on the job and learn more about the different clients you have and how you can apply yourself and what skill sets you might need. And one day you might be playing more of a project manager role, and the next day you might be playing, technical architect. And it might vary from every single client you get, or your role in the client engagement might differ as well. And it's really great because it kind of lets you switch around and try something out every, again, 6 months to a year or so. And for some people who want to try a bunch of things before they settle, that's fantastic. And then on the flip side, like Emily was talking about, maybe you kind of know where you want to go and you just want to join an industry and join a company and kind of apply yourself there. And then again, within industry, you can also do homegrown or software services and kind of get a different experience, even though you're not, you're still in the same industry and even at the same company. But again, there's definitely pros and cons to each, whereas industry might be focused on a specific company and it might be a little bit calmer. Consulting can definitely really match with an individual well by letting you kind of apply yourself and accelerate your skill growth by trying different projects. So really kind of understanding out of the gates here what you're interested in, and if you want a bunch of different things or you want some sort of familiarity is good, because you can kind of jump into one of these buckets and kind of place yourself there. But we do have a couple things we wanted to chat about, just understanding how you might be able to prepare for these different roles. So I'm going to briefly chat about the different links on the screen here, and Emily's going to throw them in the Zoom chat. But regardless of which role you're looking to get into, or regardless of what area, whether it's industry, consulting, homegrown, we really think that there's a couple things that you should take away and kind of work on and learn, so you can kind of have a good skill set. Again, it's more about being a jack of all trades and not really a master of any. So some of the links we'll be throwing in there is Business Analysis Foundations. And that's really kind of the thought process of how do you understand the business, how do you kind of derive value, scope out project work, and kind of make the right decision business. The second one here is DevOps, Cloud, and Agile. So we've talked a bit about Agile. Cloud is a favorite buzzword of mine. I like Stratus, but you might be a cumulonimbus person. I don't know. But no, seriously, the cloud and then DevOps is really thinking about how you architect your software and how you design around these different applications of cloud versus on-prem and things like that. And we think that this course on this link is a great kind of foundation about thinking about that. Enterprise data management. So if you're interested in data engineering and business analysis, when we kind of described that earlier, thinking about how do you store data, what data should you store, and things like that is fantastic. And this is a great course. SQL, or structured query language, is kind of the way you interact with the data. And we think this is a fantastic way to kind of build your kind of data definition skills and programming skills. And SQL is relatively easy to learn. And then personal projects, which are great because they let you kind of apply all of these skills in practice and really think about things on a smaller scale with a project that you might be interested in. But yeah, Emily, did you want to add anything to that?
I think you got it all covered.
Great. All right, then in that case, just to kind of wrap up here, and then we'll open it to a little bit of Q&A. I know we only have a few minutes left here, but just kind of thinking about these different questions here, as well as what we talked about, and understanding, hey, what interests me, what drives me, what's super fun to do, what do I kind of want to work around? Do I like industry or consulting? Do I like to build things in the cloud, or do I like to maybe kind of scope and define projects and manage them? But really think about kind of the questions on the screen here, and then kind of what we also talked about, and hopefully that can help you shape your thought process around what roles you might be interested in. And then hopefully you can get a jump start and kind of find something that really works for you. But as long as you remember the kind of key things, Slack is better than Teams, and that you can kind of change things up as you go, you'll be fine. So with that, I think we'll kind of open that up to questions.
I guess I have a question. I don't know if I can't remember if we touched on this, but like, how was your transition to working at Grainger? I don't know if you worked anywhere before this, but what was your experience like getting used to how like they operate?
Um, I can kind of speak on that one. So I think coming to Grainger specifically, I didn't even come from a quote unquote IT background. I was, as I said at the beginning, I was very much mechanical engineering, which is a very technical role. It is a technical field, but does not so much align with Grainger. And it was very interesting because I knew I was interested in working in technology. I had worked a previous internship that kind of made me interested in the industry sector at all, but I definitely was worried coming into Grainger, not knowing how my skills would translate. Um, and they actually align much better than you think. I mean, that technical foundation that you have, learning problem solving within a technology space is so beneficial to work with so many different roles. There's so much out there, um, kind of to your disposal, being in kind of like a STEM background. And there was a learning curve in terms of terms I needed to know and systems, but everyone here at Grainger is definitely help you willing to learn. Continuous learning is a huge thing here, so everyone was very much willing to help, and you get the work put on your plate to help you really thrive. Colton, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think you summed that up pretty well. I mean, I guess like ultimately it's really just you can prepare as much as you want, but you'll never be able to like really prepare to be able to jump into the role until you actually do it, or at least that's how I feel. I could study up and get all my skills tip top shape, but I would never get the Grainger background and knowledge that I have from working here. So the transition wasn't rough per se, but there's a lot to learn, which I personally find exciting. And I think Emily also
Definitely.
does.
We love a challenge.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we're right at time, and so I just wanted to say thank you to everyone that joined. Thank you, Emily and Colton, for providing your insight. And if anyone's interested, you will continue to see Grainger around campus. So I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.